Hi there, and welcome to MMT. I'm your host, Shaun Furman, and I'm here today with Brenner. He's a licensing specialist specializing in entertainment licensing, consumer products, and brand licensing. And today, I'd like to talk about a little bit of brand licensing. So, Rand, tell us a little bit about how you got into licensing and why you think licensing is the ultimate business.
Hi, Shaun. Thanks. And I can start by saying, like many people, I got into licensing by accident. And actually, the story is that I started my career in advertising and was kind of not finding my place in the world, so to speak, and decided to start looking for something else. And I wound up connecting with somebody who I had worked with in the advertising world. And they had contacted me and said, would you be interested in coming over to Warner Brothers and work on licensing this Batman film? And I was like, okay, what's licensing? And at that time, none of the studios were doing any licensing. It was still at the stage where entertainment was making its money on the front end. So I literally went over to Warner Brothers, interviewed, got the job, and my first day on the job, they handed me a phone and they said, go call some companies and see if they'll do something around this movie we've got, because we don't know if we're going to make any money, if anybody's going to want to see it. So let's see if we can get something on the back end with the merchandise. And that's really how I started my career. And it just took off from there. And as I said, at that time, the studios weren't interested in merchandise because they still had the front end model, syndication, advertising. You still went to the movie theaters. They made all their money. And so merchandise was really relegated to the back end. I like to share the story with, why did Lucas become as successful as he did? And the answer is because when Fox released the first round of Star Wars, they never took the rights to the merchandise. They didn't see any value in it. And of course, fast forward.
So he kept those rights.
He kept the rights, and fast forward 20 years, and now suddenly you make more off the merchandise than the movie. And of course, that set the stage for him to create a multi-billion-dollar empire that eventually sold to Disney for a couple of $1 billion. But in the 70s and 80s, up until the late 80s, really, the movie studios had no licensing. You literally, it was, some assistant in the marketing department somewhere. And so when I started, it was basically a phone and said, see if you can go find some companies. And the first project that I had the opportunity to cut my teeth on, learn about licensing, was the Batman movie. And like anything else, I just there was no training. There was no formal education. There was no program to go through. So I just learned by baptism by fire, as they say. And I got into that business and spent a number of years at Warner Brothers. And then from there, I went to Saban Entertainment, where I ran the division at the height of the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. And during the course of my time at the studios, I really got involved in licensing and got to see the potential of it. Obviously, it generated a lot of money very quickly, turned into hundreds of millions of dollars. And I'd say after the Batman movie launched, and suddenly all this merchandise was being sold, that's when the studios woke up and said, hey, wait a minute, there's money to be made here. And shortly after the Batman movie launched, a lot of the studios started organizing their licensing divisions. And it was an interesting time in the business. And now it's matured and it's really on the front end. So, I spent my time in the industry. And, when you're inside of an industry, a lot of times you just assume people understand what you're doing or what it's about. And it wasn't really till I left the studio side and set up my own company, Licensing Consulting Group, and started working with companies that wanted to acquire entertainment brands. And then I had the opportunity to begin speaking about licensing, because I figured, okay, people probably are familiar with it and they'd want some inside tips on studios and licensing. So I started talking to people, and that's when I realized, many people really don't know what licensing is.
So why don't we start there with what is licensing? Because that's something that I think a lot of people get a little bit fuzzy when it comes to, because it's not, you don't see it immediately. It's all contracts.
And, that's actually a good point. I think that most people that I encounter, when you talk about licensing, they think of it as a legal thing. And that's not what licensing is. Legal is part of it, but what licensing is it's a process of making money with intellectual property. That's what it is. And I discovered that when I started talking to people, people didn't know what licensing was. They have this idea that it's a legal thing. And I realized that Suddenly, the lights went off, and I said, well, wait a minute. No, you make money with it. And that's when I started looking around and saying, holy cow, nobody is teaching this stuff. And I'm excited about it. You can tell I'm a little bit passionate about it. But I realized, wait a minute, intellectual property is such a huge market, yet nobody is learning the skill sets of licensing. And it's really about making money. And what I like to share with people is I use the analogy of real estate, because you're big into real estate. Now, real estate is something, if you think about it, you understand the process of locating properties, doing your inspection, writing the contracts, getting the financing, doing all the stuff, right? And generally, for most people, they're familiar with it, and it's not intimidating, and they generally feel comfortable jumping in to buy their first house, get a second piece of real estate, whatever, because they understand the process and the system. And what I realized is nobody understands the process and the system of licensing. They hear this term and they think of it as legal. And that's really what got me thinking that, wait a minute, more people need to understand what licensing is, because it really is a skill system and a process, much like real estate.
So what is that process?
What the process is, the process of making money with licensing is almost identical to making money with real estate. Okay, and I'll share this analogy with you. Real estate is a tangible piece of property. Intellectual property is an intangible piece of property. Now, interestingly enough, they're both called properties. Okay, the difference is that within intellectual property, and here I'm talking about a patent, trademark, copyright, and then there's even some what's called unregistered, such as know-how, trade secrets like recipes and formulas. The difference is that with intellectual property, you have to transform it into a tangible something, a product, a service, a toy, a t-shirt, whatever. The process is almost the same. What you do with intellectual property, if you own it, say you're a property owner, whether it's real estate or intellectual property, basically what you do is you fix it up and you go out and you start promoting it as for sale or available for license. I'm talking about intellectual property. And what you're doing now is you're presenting it, you put the information out to the market, somebody who is interested in acquiring rights to that property, because when you license, you're basically renting your property. You're not selling it, you're renting it. And basically what you're doing is you're presenting it, you're finding somebody who's interested in acquiring those rights and doing something with your intellectual property, making the products and selling it. You're writing up a contract, just like a real estate contract, that says, I'm the property owner, you're the property renter, you pay me a licensing fee as the rent, you have the rights to use this property and do these things with it, and in return you pay me some money, and then there's some other terms in there that people agree to. And then that person in turn takes your intellectual property and does something with it, whether, like I said, making the products, whatever the case is. Now, unlike a piece of real estate, with intellectual property, you can do that process over and over and over again.
So
for example,
your idea to several different people for different kinds
exactly.
of uses. Okay.
Exactly. That's what you're doing with your intellectual property. You're basically renting it to several people, unlike a single piece of property, tangible property, where you can only rent it once. Obviously, if you have one tenant, you can't rent it to any more tenants. But with intellectual property, you can rent it over and over and over again, depending on what your IP is. And the example I like to give is entertainment, because that's a very visible form of intellectual property. And the movies that I worked on, such as a Batman or a Power Rangers, basically what happened is the intellectual property was that movie, that visual thing that you see, right? And then what happened is we took that intellectual property now and we rented the rights to make toys or t-shirts or hats or skis or whatever over and over and over again. And suddenly it generated tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars from all these companies. I mean, think about it like this. Imagine if you had, say, a book or a TV show or even your TV show, and you were able to rent it out to 1,000 different people to be able to make and sell it in some form, and they were all paying you money. Suddenly you could begin to see how much money could be generated there, and that's how a lot of these big movie properties grow. But it's not only movies. I just use movies as an example, but you could think about inventions and apps and electronics and software and on and on and on. I mean, everything is intellectual property today. You're surrounded by it. You're using it. We're talking over intellectual property. People don't realize that. We're in an intellectual property world today.
Yes. So when we talk about brand licensing, how does brand licensing work for a company, say Virgin? The Virgin Group has over 400 different companies under one brand, but it's a licensed brand.
And branding is a real good example. When you see these brands that have been built up over the years, Virgin is a good example of a brand. We talked about Trump before the show. These brands have become known in the world. People are aware of them. And basically what happens, and you can do this even with your own brand, is once you've created that visibility and people know what it is, you have the ability then to license it out to other companies for different products. For example, I'll use the Trump brand because I've had a little interaction with that brand. But basically what they're able to do with the Trump name is they've gone out and they've been able to apply it to liquor, to cosmetics, to perfumes, to clothing, to other types of products that represent the brand, if you will. And you see this over and over again. And in the case of Virgin, you see Virgin uses licensing to expand its brand into other categories that are typically non-competitive. It might be apparel, it might be shirts, it might be stores, it could be electronics, it could be cell phones, wherever the case is. Virgin has expanded its brand using licensing, and many big brands out there today that you look around, such as Coca-Cola or Pepsi or Ford or GM, they use licensing programs to license out to other product categories and expand, their visibility so people know who they are. And they make a lot of money doing it while they're doing it.
Well, you'll see people with a Ford clock on the wall or a Coca-Cola, collection of whatever they have. So that's all licensed stuff.
It's most of it is licensed stuff. And in fact, you'll find a lot of brands today have completely gotten out of the manufacturing business. A lot of apparel companies today, they no longer make any apparel. What they do is they use a pure licensing program. They let other companies, because when you license, your cost, your overhead to do a licensing program is very minimal as compared to having to make and produce something yourself. And so many companies such as Tommy Hilfiger, Ocean Pacific, just to name a few, have gone to pure licensing models. Okay, and what they're doing is they've licensed hundreds of manufacturers to use their brands and make their products. And many people don't even realize that when they go to retail today and they're buying Chanel products or they're buying Hilfiger or whatever the case is, that oftentimes they assume that it's being made by the company when in reality it's a licensing deal, and basically it's the brand that's being licensed to the company that's making those products that they're buying.
Okay, so how does I wanted to talk about franchising versus licensing, but we'll
Good question.
That second.
Okay.
I want to talk about how does this work for the little guy. I've heard you talk about when the Power Rangers in the 90s just exploded, you had these work-from-home guys would come into the office and write these huge checks.
Good example, and that's true. The nice thing about intellectual property and licensing is anybody can do it. Okay, it's not limited to the big. I share some of these big stories, but you raise a good point on Power Rangers, and this even was in Batman. In the early days of those movie and TV shows getting started, it wasn't so easy to go out and find big companies to take them because they're looking for things that are established and ready to go. But the companies that made a lot of money, and you brought up the Power Rangers. In fact, most of the deals that I did early on with Power Rangers were the small guys and girls working out of the garage who were smart enough to figure out, maybe I can go in and get a license for the rights to use this TV show. And there's a lot of companies that do that. They go shopping at the studios and the different TV networks to find these shows. But they got it because they were willing to take a risk, and they saw that there could be some value in a show that got put on the air. So in the early days, and I share one story with a gentleman, I'll call him Sam, but he used to be very irritating. He used to have this high-pitched nasally voice and would come in, and he was always a bother, but I'll never forget the day I was in my office, and he comes shuffling in, and he always had a wrinkled shirt and wrinkled pants on. And he said, "Sam's here." I said, "Sam, sit down." And he had this nasally. He goes, "Hi, Rand." I go, "What is it?" "Sit down." He goes, "I'm here to pay my royalties." And I'm like, "Okay, fine." And he only had a small license, a couple of these small items like a water bottle, some mugs, and something else, basically that you put labels on, but it was at the height of Power Rangers. He pulled out his checkbook. It was wrinkled. He starts writing a check. I'm not paying attention. He tears it off and he hands it to me, and it's a check for $1 million. And I looked at it and I said, Sam, I go, what is this? He goes, well, that's our royalties for last quarter. I go, why? He goes, because we sold $10 million worth of merchandise to Walmart. And they had had the license about 18 months. And of course, when it built up to the high point, they were making a lot of money. And that story goes on over and over again. There are many companies that came in. And a lot of these companies were just simply entrepreneurs working out of their garage, or one or two people in an office, but they had the understanding of, wait a minute, there's a movie or a TV show. I think there's something there. Why don't I go in and see if I can get a license for it? Let me take a shot at it. And so oftentimes they would go in there and they would get these deals for $2,500 up front, $5,000 up front, and a 2-year deal to see if they could make something happen. And sure enough, they happened to get on the right show because it took off. Now, not every show is like that, but this goes on over and over. If you're a small guy, you can look at any number of these big brands. We talked about Virgin and Trump. You know, these are great opportunities if you're an entrepreneur, a small company, and you're looking, boy, how can I grow? How can I open up? How can I get into retail? Go license a big brand, because it's a great strategy. I'll share another story with you. I had a toy company. New toy company came into the U.S. and they had a new technology, and they wanted to launch their products in the U.S. And when I talked to them, I said, how much money do you have? Because you're going to need to spend a lot of money promoting it, because you just don't walk into a retailer and sell the products. So they said, well, we're going to promote it and see if we can establish our brand. And I asked them, have you thought about licensing? And they said, well, what do you mean? And I said, have you thought about going out and getting somebody else's brand to put on your products and bring it into the market? And the long and the short of it is they came back and they said, that sounds like a great idea. What should we do? I said, well, let's go find some of the biggest kids brands that are already established for kids toys. In this case, they have preschool. So we went and got the Wiggles and Thomas the Tank are two examples. And basically what we did is we negotiated a deal to get those licenses for not a lot of money up front. And we wrapped their products in these. And the result was they were able to immediately start meeting with retailers, mass market, who they were trying to get into. And they sold product in right away. Why? Because it was a recognized brand, as opposed to their own, which can be very challenging. So they used that strategy to get in the market, sold several $1 million in product, and that's what ramped them up. So they wound up getting their products into the U.S. market in about 18 months, as opposed to spending years trying to get to that point of being able to get in the market. And that's using other people's brands. I call it other people's resources. So if for anybody, if you're looking for a way that you can speed up what you're doing, take a look at some of these big brands. They're great licensing opportunities.
So how does a small company get a license from a big brand?
Well, I'd say first, the best thing to do is find the brand you're interested in, do some research, call up and say, are licensing rights available for a certain category? If let's say you're making pencils and toothbrushes, call up and find out. Are pencils and toothbrushes available? Make sure, though, and here's something that a strategy is: make sure that whatever brand you're going after, the products or the technology or the services that you have make sense for the brand, okay? Because that's what the brand owners are looking for. They're looking for ways to expand their brand on products that make sense, that reflect the brand, okay?
So for Trump, you wouldn't want to put a low-end item.
No, Trump wouldn't be exactly. That's a perfect example. I mean, if it's a high-end brand, then go in there with high-end products. If it's more of a mass market, like let's say a Coca-Cola, maybe you could be looking at some lower-priced products. So make sure that there's a good match there. The next thing that you need to do is you got to understand that these are big brand owners, and they're looking for companies that have the ability to get into the market with their products and be able to establish them at retail. Now, the nice thing about working with big brands is think of it as like a big partner. Is once you get the brand, you're able to go into the retail channels where those brands already are. So you want to make sure that you're ready to be able to produce the products. I always say that if you're going to go present to a big brand, then make sure you act like a big brand, which means that you go in there with a buttoned-up presentation, you know what you're talking about, you know where you want to go, and do a little homework. If you do that, you have a pretty good shot at getting a license deal.
So you start by going to the brand that you want to acquire a license for, you put it on your product, potentially, and then you go to another company that can distribute that kind of product.
That's one way you can do it, but here's another trick for you. What I like to share about licensing, especially big brands, is Some of them have it and some of them don't. But I'll talk about entertainment brands for a moment because they do. They have what's called a retail development arm. And what these retail development people do is they spend all day just talking to all the retail buyers around the country, telling them all the new licensed products that are coming on board. So if you go to one of these big brands and you get a license, you can also ask them, are you doing anything at retail? Do you have any retail development? If they say yes, they'll put you in touch with these people. Now, what these retail development people can do, you can tell them, I'm a new licensee, I'm producing this product, can you tell me what retailers you're working with? They'll be glad to give you a list, and they'll make introductions for you. So what happens here is you've got a partner that can help you get in there. You're not on your own with having to find your own distributors. You can go right to the retail channels they already established. But when you get the brand, then your next step is to make sure that you're ready to be able to produce it and to, you know, deliver it into a retailer. And so the other thing that I like to tell people, the other tip is, if you're a small company and you want to license a big brand, make sure that the channel you want to go into, I'm talking about the retail channel, is one that you can support. For example, if you license a big brand and you say, this brand, let's say, is mass market and is very visible in Walmart, for example, do you have the ability to make and produce and deliver product to Walmart? Because that's a very demanding retail account. If you don't, then it's not advisable to go after that brand, because what's going to happen is you don't have the capabilities to support it, to go where that brand is. So the thing to do is to find a brand where you can match up your own capabilities with that brand, and then take advantage of whatever the retail channels are or the promotion or whatever it is that brand is offering you as the entrepreneur or small company.
Yeah, can you give a real life example with a company name there? Or would that be a breach of any kind of contract?
No, it wouldn't. Well, I've given you the example with the toy company, but I worked with another client, and what we wanted to do was basically we wanted to ramp up sales for their hair product. So what we did is we went to the trade show and we looked for some of the big brands, the Vidal Sassoons and the things like that, and we approached those companies to get a license, and we ultimately did. I can't remember which hair company, but basically we were able to get their brand to put on this hair accessory item. It was for what do you call it? Flat iron rollers, to keep them insulated so they don't burn up your bag after you've used them. So it was like Sassoon or somebody like that, Clairol, but we were able to get that license, and basically what we did is we applied that brand to that product. That then opened the door, and they were able to start selling their product into some of the, for instance, the hair salons and some of the specialty hair stores. Okay, they weren't in a position to go into the bigger chains like Target, but they were able to get in much faster into the hair salons and specialty hair stores that were out there. So that was a strategy that we used. I think it cost them probably about $5,000 up front to get that brand, because it was only for one item, but it gave them immediate recognition, and it was sure a lot easier than trying to sell in a generic hair accessory that these retailers don't know about.
Okay, now I understand that whole process that you just described. Now,
so go ahead. You had a follow-up question to that?
Now let's get into franchising versus licensing.
Okay, good, and that's an excellent question. Franchising and licensing are the same thing, but there's a significant difference, okay? And I'll start with franchising. Basically, as a franchisee, you are a licensee, but the reason it's called a franchise is because basically it's what's called a business opportunity. So, for example, you want to become a McDonald's franchise, right? So you have to go in and you get the rights to open up and operate a franchise, but you have to pay them a lot of money. You have to open up a retail location. You have to set up the store. You have to adhere by their guidelines. You have to go through their training. You have to buy supplies from them. You have to do everything the McDonald's way. And then in turn, you pay them a percentage of everything you sell, just like a licensing deal. And so it's, as a franchise, it's also falls under SEC guidelines, okay, because it's a business opportunity and investment, which means that you have to get it approved to be able to offer a franchise in different states, okay. A license agreement, basically, you're taking your brand, let's say, and you're already going to somebody who's already in business. They're already making T-shirts or hats or shorts or whatever it is, and you're saying, would you like the rights to use my brand on your T-shirts or hats or shorts or whatever it is? So all you're doing is you're giving them the rights to use your brand. You're giving them the right to use your logos and everything else, but you're not requiring them to create a business. You're not requiring them to go through a training program. You're letting them run it through their established business. So does that make...
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So with a brand, you're getting people's resources, and you're not so much controlling how they operate and what they do with that operation. They just...
That's on the licensing side. On the franchise side, and that's a good way of putting it. Franchise side, they're controlling the operations, the marketing, the delivery. Whereas on the licensing side, what you're doing is you're just controlling the quality of what they deliver, not how they make it and how they sell it. And you're not requiring them to get anything from you beyond just the rights to use that intellectual property. So I try to keep that as simple as possible.
Okay. So do you work with people on both of those sides?
No, I don't work on the franchise side. That requires, that's a completely different market. And it, you raise a good point here, because there are a lot of businesses that have created their brands. And especially if it's a business service, I mean, there's a lot of brands out there that become franchises, okay, because they have cookies or ice cream or whatever the case is. But there's other brands out there that even though they have a product associated with it and they can create a franchise, they happen to use a licensing model to expand the brand as opposed to franchise. It's much simpler. Licensing, basically, you can go anywhere and work with anyone. Like I said, with franchising, it's more restrictive. And you find a lot of these, and there's some franchises that are actually a blend. And I'll give you an example. Everybody, you're familiar with Mrs. Fields Cookies.
Yes.
Okay. Mrs. Fields Cookies has franchise stores, but they also have a licensing program where they take it into ice cream, cakes, desserts, recipe books, cookbooks. Those are all licensed out. So they actually use a blend between the two. And their focus is on obviously running the franchise store, but then they let the licensees go out with other products. So you can do both, and you find that strategy can often be used. It's often used actually by a number of brands, not only Mrs. Fields, but there's other companies out there that offer food products and things like that they also use licensing to get more of a brand exposure.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So my next question would be, going back to licensing versus franchising. With licensing, you're relying more on that person's, I guess, talents in the way that they do things. So you'd be looking more for a partner more than someone who's operating the business.
That's a perfect example of it. Basically, a licensing is a partner who's already got the expertise and everything set. You're looking for a partner who's already got a wheel that's rolling, okay? Their wheel is already rolling. And a franchise, you're basically getting an operator who's got to build the wheel and then start rolling it with your direction, okay? And it's a big difference. And even getting a franchise, you still have to do a startup on that to a certain extent. But obviously, the risk factor is a lot lower than starting a business from scratch. But I like to say that if you use the licensing model and you go after the licensing model, in many ways it reduces your risk when you go to the market. Because if you're working with somebody that's already out there with a wheel that's rolling and it's rolling just fine, then all you're doing is plugging into it, and you don't have to worry about the unknowns of getting it made. Do they have distribution? Where can I sell it? The advertising, the promotion, the overhead, and all that other stuff that goes along with it.
So you're okay. All right, Rand, we're about out of time here, but where can we send people to find out more about you and to get a hold of your products?
Okay, I have a couple of websites, but let me give you the one that everybody should go to. It's called Licensing for Profits. That's licensing, the number 4, profits.com. Now, if you go there, you're going to find a whole host of information. You're going to find a blog with a lot of information about licensing. I write 3 and 4 times a week on different aspects of licensing, some of the things that we talked on here, brands, trademarks, copyrights. On there, you're also going to find a series of audio workshops that I've created. And a lot of it goes back to the comment I made earlier, is giving people the information, the wisdom, the tools, the skill set to be able to go out and do this itself. Everybody should be in the licensing business. So there you'll find my audio workshop products. I have several products that start with IP to income. If you're new and you just want to get the basics, start there. You can move up to IP Money Magic, which is going to get you the whole 9 yards of taking a IP from start to finish and into licensing and how to manage the program. If you're a small business and you're operating a business and say, how can I use licensing to expand, take advantage of my intellectual property, you'll find licensing leverage for small businesses. And then, of course, if you're an author, speaker, trainer, or coach, you have professional expertise, knowledge, things like that. I have licensing your expertise, which basically says, how can I replicate myself and expand my consulting or speaking or training throughout the world? And you can use licensing to do that. So that's licensingforprofits.com. Go and visit there. I think your viewers are really going to enjoy the information that's there.
That's perfect. All right, thanks. It's been a pleasure having you on, Rand.
Thanks, Shaun. Enjoyed it.
Yeah, have a great day.
Okay.
All right, I hope you enjoyed this video, and be sure to like, share, and comment below. Subscribe to this channel for more interviews, and if you want to go further and be live on the interviews, you can go to mmt.tv/live to find out how. Like on Facebook and follow on Twitter to ask your questions, and be sure to get on the mailing list. Go to mmt.tv to get access to all the things that are not contained in these interviews. All the links are mentioned below, and until next time, break the rules, change the game, and be a rock star.